Some people have lucky socks or special routines before important meetings. I have my parking spot. It's not marked with my name. There's no reserved sign. It's just a rectangle of asphalt outside my office window on the west side of the building. To most people, it's indistinguishable from the 20 other spots in the lot. But to me, it's the difference between a productive day and 8 hours of hypervigilance. I've worked at Meridian Consulting for 3 years now. The transition from military to civilian life wasn't what they promised in those pre-discharge workshops. They talk about resume building and interview skills, but no one prepares you for how ordinary moments can suddenly split open, revealing the raw nerves beneath. No one mentions how a slammed door can send you diving for cover, or how the scent of diesel fuel can transport you across continents in an instant. When I first started, I deliberately chose the office with the window facing the parking lot. My supervisor thought I wanted the natural light. What I wanted was a sight line. I needed to see my vehicle, to know there was a path to safety if things went sideways. My therapist calls this establishing environmental control. I call it survival. For the first 2 years, no one questioned my unspoken claim to that particular parking spot. Maybe they noticed I always arrived early enough to secure it. Maybe they saw something in my eyes on the rare occasions when someone else's car occupied that space. The tightness around my mouth, the slight tremor in my hands as I tried to recalibrate my sense of safety. Whatever the reason, the spot remained mine through an invisible understanding. Until 3 months ago. I don't know what changed. Maybe it was the new hires in accounting who didn't know the unwritten rules. Maybe it was just that enough time had passed that my colleagues forgot or stopped caring about the peculiarities of the combat veteran in their midst. All I know is that suddenly, my anchor was gone. The first time it happened, I managed. I parked elsewhere, spent the day with my back to the wall instead of the window, took my anti-anxiety medication at lunch, and made it through. When it happened again the next day, I mentioned it casually to my coworker. "Oh, is that your regular spot?" she asked, her voice light but her eyes watchful. "I didn't realize we had assigned parking." "We don't," I admitted. I like to park there. It helps me focus." She nodded, but something in her expression made me uncomfortable, like I'd revealed a weakness she hadn't expected to see. I didn't explain further. I didn't tell her about the dreams that still wake me at night, the sensation of sand in my mouth even in the midst of a Midwestern winter, the way my body remembers trauma, my mind is trying to forget. I didn't tell her that from my desk I can see my truck through that window, and knowing it's there, knowing I have an escape route, is sometimes the only thing that keeps the panic at bay when the fluorescent lights flicker in just the wrong way. I didn't tell her that in Afghanistan, I learned that survival sometimes depends on having a way out. Instead, I smiled tightly and changed the subject. It wasn't her problem. It was mine, another invisible wound I carried home from a desert battlefield. The next day, my spot was free. And the day after that, I began to relax, to believe the disruption had been temporary. I settled back into my routine, arrive at 7:45, park in my spot, grab coffee from the break room, boot up my computer by 8:00. The predictability was soothing. The familiarity was healing. And then, it began in earnest. I didn't recognize it as a pattern at first. Once a week, maybe twice, I'd arrive to find someone else's car in my spot. Different vehicles each time. Sometimes it was the silver Accord from accounting. Other times, the red Jeep from marketing. Once, it was my direct supervisor's BMW. Each time, I'd feel that initial surge of adrenaline, the fight-or-flight response that never quite turned off when I came home. Each time, I'd force myself to breathe through it, to find another parking space, to walk through the main entrance instead of the side door near my office. Each time, I'd spend the day slightly off-kilter, like a top spinning just a little too far one side. I started arriving earlier, 7:30, then 7:15. I'd sit in my truck in the empty parking lot, waiting for the building to open, just to ensure I got my spot. But somehow, occasionally, someone would still beat me to it. It was after one of those mornings, I'd arrived to find a blue Subaru in my space despite getting there at 7:10, that I first noticed the glances. A group of coworkers at the coffee machine, their conversation dropping to whispers as I approached. The way the owner of the Subaru watched me over her monitor, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth when our eyes met. That's when I realized they knew. They knew exactly what they were doing. The suspicion sat cold and heavy in my stomach all day. I told myself I was being paranoid. That the hypervigilance that had kept me alive in combat was now manufacturing threats where none existed. That my coworkers couldn't possibly be so deliberately cruel. But as I packed up to leave that evening, I overheard two of them in the hallway. "Did you see his face this morning?" one of them asked, voice low but not quite low enough. "Priceless," the other replied with a laugh. "Marissa's doing it next Tuesday. She already asked me to switch shifts so she can get here early." I froze, my hand still on my office door, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't paranoia. It was reality. They were deliberately taking my parking spot, watching for my reaction, turning my private struggle into office entertainment. For a moment, I was back in the dirt and heat, watching for the slight disturbance in the earth that might indicate an IED. That same hyper-awareness flooded my system. That same cold calculation of threat and response. I drove home in a fog that night, the world around me distant and muffled, as though I were underwater. Inside my apartment, I stood under the shower until the hot water ran out, trying to wash away a feeling of exposure, of vulnerability. They had found my trigger, and they were pressing it for fun. For the next 2 weeks, it became a game to them. I never knew which day I arrived to find my spot taken, never knew which of my coworkers would be watching for my reaction when I walked into the office. Some days passed normally. Other days, I'd spend 8 hours with my skin crawling, jumpiness increasing with every knowing smirk or whispered comment. I tried different approaches. I tried ignoring it completely, parking elsewhere without reaction. I tried arriving so early that the building wasn't even open yet. I tried staying late the night before, sleeping in my truck in the back of the lot, just to ensure I could claim my spot when morning came. Each adaptation seemed to amuse them more. After particularly bad days, I'd sit in my therapist's office, trying to explain why something so seemingly trivial was eroding my sense of safety so profoundly. "It's not just about the parking spot," I said during one session, my hands clenched so tightly that my knuckles shone white beneath the skin. "It's about control." In Afghanistan, control meant survival. Knowing the terrain, securing your position, having an exit strategy. These weren't preferences, they were necessities. My therapist nodded. "What you're experiencing is very common in combat veterans. The brain forms strong associations between certain behaviors and safety. When those behaviors are disrupted, it can trigger your threat response system." "But how do I explain that to people who think I'm just being difficult about a parking space?" I asked, frustration cracking my voice. "How do I tell my coworkers that what feels like a harmless prank to them feels like a threat to my survival to me?" "Have you tried being direct about it?" she asked. Sometimes people genuinely don't understand the impact of their actions. But I knew better. I'd seen the calculated enjoyment in their eyes when I walked in flustered after finding my spot taken. They understood enough to know it bothered me. They just didn't care why. Still, I decided to try. The next morning, finding a green Toyota in my spot, I tracked down its owner, a younger guy from it who'd been with the company less than 6 months. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I noticed you parked in that spot by the west window today." He looked up from his computer, his expression carefully neutral, but I caught the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah? Is there a problem?" I took a deep breath, tried to find the right words. "Look, I know there's no assigned parking, but I usually park there. It helps me manage some PTSD symptoms from my time in Afghanistan." For a moment his expression faltered, and I thought maybe I'd gotten through to him. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. "No assigned spots means anyone can park anywhere," he said. "Maybe you should talk to someone about getting so worked up over a parking spot." The dismissal hit me like a physical blow. I'd shown vulnerability, opened a door to understanding, and he'd slammed it shut in my face. "You're right," I said, my voice suddenly hollow even to my own ears. "My mistake." I walked away, shame burning in my chest, shame for having exposed a weakness, shame for having hope for compassion, shame for being affected by something that seems so trivial to everyone else. That afternoon, I overheard him recounting our conversation to a group in the break room, exaggerating my reaction, mocking the very concept that a parking spot could be connected to PTSD. The laughter that followed felt like shrapnel. I began to dread going to work. Sleep, already elusive, became almost impossible. I'd lie awake until 3 or 4 a.m., then drag myself up at 6 just to ensure I'd get to the office before anyone else. My performance started to slip. Deadlines I'd never missed before became challenges. My supervisor began sending concerned emails about incomplete projects. The final breaking point came on a Thursday morning in early spring. I'd managed exactly 2 hours of sleep before my alarm. My anti-anxiety medication was running low, because I'd been doubling up on doses just to get through the workday. I arrived at 7:05, exhausted but relieved to see the parking lot still empty. Except for one car. A red Jeep, parked precisely in my spot. Something in me fractured. I pulled up beside the Jeep, got out, and stood there staring at it for a long moment. I thought about all the times I'd tried to be reasonable. All the times I'd swallowed my distress and carried on. All the times I'd pathologized my own reactions instead of questioning theirs. A wild, desperate idea formed in my mind. I took out my phone, pulled up the website for a local towing company, and took a photo of the Jeep. I didn't call. I wouldn't actually have someone's car towed from a lot where they had every right to park. But, for just a moment, the fantasy of consequences gave me a sense of power I hadn't felt in months. As I turned to walk into the building, the Jeep's owner appeared at the side entrance. She looked at me, at my phone, and at her vehicle. "Were you taking pictures of my car?" she demanded. "Just documenting," I said, hearing the dangerous edge in my own voice but unable to soften it. "In case I need to have it towed." Her eyes widened. "Hurry. You can't do that. This isn't your personal parking lot. And this isn't your personal game," I snapped back. "But you've all been playing it for months anyway." She stepped backward, seeming genuinely startled by my intensity. "It's just a parking spot." Jesus, learn to take a joke. "A joke is something everyone finds funny," I said, my voice dropping lower. "This is targeted harassment." I walked away, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I hadn't meant to make that threat. I knew it was excessive, knew it was ultimately empty. But months of deliberate triggering had finally sparked a response they couldn't dismiss with laughter. By noon, I'd been called into my boss's office. "I understand there was an incident in the parking lot this morning," my boss said without preamble as I sat across from her desk. I nodded, suddenly aware of how this must look from the outside. A combat veteran with known PTSD, threatening to tow a co-worker's car over an unassigned parking space. Heat crept up my neck. "Would you like to explain your side of things?" she asked, her tone careful, as though she were addressing someone volatile. That's when I realized what was happening. In their telling, I was the aggressor. The months of deliberate provocation had been erased, leaving only my response as evidence. I was being painted as unstable, as dangerous, as the stereotype of the broken veteran who couldn't adapt to civilian life. For a moment, I considered walking out, quitting on the spot rather than trying to defend myself against an accusation that was technically true but contextually false. Instead, I took a deep breath and decided to lay everything bare. For the past 3 months, I began slowly. Several people in the office have been deliberately parking in the space I've used since I started here. It's become something of a game to them, taking turns, watching for my reaction, laughing about it later. My boss's expression remained neutral. "As I understand it, we don't have assigned parking spaces." "We don't," I agreed. "Which is why I've never formally complained before now. But this isn't about policy. It's about intent." I explained about my PTSD, about the importance of visual access to my vehicle, about the safety behaviors that helped me function in civilian environments. I explained how what had started as an occasional inconvenience had evolved into systematic targeting. "I'm not proud of how I reacted this morning," I admitted. "I wouldn't actually have towed anyone's car. But after months of having my mental health deliberately triggered for entertainment, I snapped. And I think that was the goal all along, to push until I reacted in a way that would make me look unstable." My boss was silent for a long moment, her expression shifting subtly as she processed what I'd shared. Then she asked, "Why do you believe this was deliberate rather than coincidental?" "Because I've overheard them planning it. Arranging schedules to make sure someone could arrive early enough to take that spot. Laughing about my reactions afterward. When I tried to explain about my PTSD, it just gave them more ammunition for mockery." Something changed in her face then, a hardening around the eyes, a tightening of the jaw. What you're describing," she said carefully, "would constitute workplace harassment under our policies, specifically targeting someone's medical condition for amusement or distress." I hadn't expected that response. I'd been prepared for skepticism, for a lecture about proportionate responses, for a warning about threatening coworkers' property. Instead, my boss was viewing the situation through an entirely different lens than the one I'd been using. "I suppose it would," I said slowly. "Though I've never thought of it in those terms before." Discrimination, she said, the word heavy with implication. If what you're saying is accurate, then you've been experiencing discrimination based on a service-related disability. The word landed like a revelation. Discrimination. Not oversensitivity on my part. Not a failure to adapt. Not an inability to take a joke. Discrimination. The systematic targeting of a person based on a protected characteristic. For months, I'd internalized their narrative, that my reaction was the problem, that my need for consistency was the aberration, that my disability was a character flaw rather than a medical condition. I'd accepted their framing that I was asking for special treatment rather than basic respect. My brother-in-law served 2 tours in Iraq, my boss continued, her voice softer now. I've seen firsthand how PTSD manifests, how certain triggers can seem irrational from the outside, but are viscerally real to the person experiencing them. What you're describing isn't a parking dispute. It's a hostile work environment. Validation was so unexpected that for a moment, I couldn't speak past the tightness in my throat. All these months, I'd been carrying not only the weight of my condition, but the added burden of believing I was wrong for having it. The relief of having someone understand, truly understand, left me momentarily defenseless against my own emotions. I want to address this immediately, she continued. Can you provide me with names of the individuals involved? I hesitated. Despite everything, there was still that military-ingrained reluctance to rat out teammates. But these people weren't my teammates. They had deliberately positioned themselves as adversaries. I said. But I need to be clear. I don't want revenge. I just want it to stop. I just want to be able to come to work without dreading what new way they'll find to push my buttons that day. This isn't about revenge, my boss assured me. It's about workplace safety and professional conduct. No one should be targeted for a medical condition, especially not one acquired in service to this country. As I left her office an hour later, after naming names and providing dates and details, I felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The weight of solitary suffering had been lifted, but in its place was the uncertainty of what would happen next. Would things improve? Or would covert harassment simply transform into overt resentment? The next week passed in a blur of closed-door meetings and awkward silences in the break room. I wasn't privy to the conversations my boss had with the involved parties, but the effects were immediately apparent. The parking game stopped. My spot remained untouched, day after day. The whispers ceased, or at least became inaudible to me. What I hadn't anticipated was the backlash. It came in subtle forms at first, emails that went unanswered, invitations to lunch that stopped coming, collaborative projects where my input was requested later and later in the process, if at all. Then came the more overt expressions, cold shoulders in the hallway, conversations that halted when I entered a room, direct challenges to my ideas in meetings that would have gone unchallenged before. The most explicit confrontation came 2 weeks after my meeting with the boss. I was working late, the office nearly empty, when one of the main instigators of the parking game stopped by my open door. "So, discrimination, huh?" she said without preamble. "That's a pretty heavy accusation to throw around over a parking spot." I looked up from my computer, studied her face. There was anger there, but something else too, a defensive posture that suggested she still didn't understand the gravity of what had happened. "It wasn't about the parking spot," I said quietly. "It was about deliberately triggering someone's medical condition for entertainment. Would you think it was just a joke if someone hid an epileptic's medication and then filmed their seizure?" She flinched slightly at the comparison. "That's not the same thing, isn't it? Both involve deliberately causing distress based on a medical condition. Both involve taking pleasure in someone else's suffering." "We didn't know it was that serious," she protested, but the words rang hollow. I'd told them. I'd explained my PTSD. They'd chosen not to believe or respect it. "You knew it bothered me," I said simply. "And you did it anyway." Repeatedly. Systematically. That's what makes it discrimination, not the parking spot itself. She stood in silence for a moment, perhaps searching for a defense that didn't exist. Finally, she shook her head. "You could have handled it differently. You didn't have to go nuclear and get everyone in trouble." The unfairness of this statement struck me like a physical blow. For months, I'd adapted, accommodated, suffered in silence. I'd tried direct communication. I'd tried ignoring the problem. I'd tried arriving earlier and earlier just to avoid conflict. I exhausted every option before finally standing up for myself. "I tried handling it differently," I said, my voice steady despite the anger rising in my chest. "For 3 months, I tried. You all made it clear that nothing short of formal intervention would stop the behavior." She left without another word, but her visit set the tone for the weeks that followed. I became the problem, not the harassment, not the discrimination, but my refusal to continue tolerating it. In the narrative that circulated through office gossip, I was oversensitive, vindictive, unable to take a joke. The fact that the joke had been my psychological distress seemed irrelevant to them. My boss, to her credit, remained firmly supportive. When she noticed the social isolation developing, she made a point of including me in key projects and meetings. When collaborative work became challenging due to the tension, she restructured teams. She couldn't force people to like me, but she could and did insist that they treat me with professional respect. Still, something fundamental had changed. I'd come to this job hoping to build a new life, a new identity beyond my military service. Instead, I'd become defined by it once again, not as a veteran to be respected, but as a damaged person to be tolerated, a liability to be managed. Some nights, I'd sit in my truck after work staring at that parking spot, my spot, and wonder if standing up for myself had been worth the cost. Had I traded one form of suffering for another? Had I merely exchanged the acute stress of targeted harassment for the chronic stress of social isolation? On my darkest days, I questioned whether there was any place in civilian society where I truly fit, where I could be seen as both a veteran and a person, where my service-connected disabilities would be accommodated without defining me entirely. My therapist reminded me that workplace cultures don't change overnight, that standing up to discrimination is always uncomfortable but necessary, that the discomfort I was experiencing was the natural resistance to long overdue change. "You're not just doing this for yourself," she said during one particularly difficult session. "You're doing it for every other veteran who will work there in the future. You're establishing boundaries that will protect others who come after you." I wanted to believe her. Some days I even did. 3 months after the confrontation, I sat in my truck in the parking lot, staring at the building where I'd spent the last 3 years of my professional life. In my hand was a job offer from another company, better pay, similar work, a fresh start. I'd been on the verge of accepting it for weeks. The atmosphere at Meridian had improved somewhat, but never returned to normal. The explicit harassment had ended, but the subtle ostracism continued. Wow. Every day felt like walking through emotional quicksand, not overtly threatening, but exhausting in its constant drag. The new company had no knowledge of my history here. I could start over, be known for my work rather than my complaint. I could leave the parking spot and all its associated drama behind. And yet, I hesitated. Leaving felt like conceding that they were right, that I had overreacted, that workplace harmony was more important than basic dignity, that veterans with PTSD were too much trouble to accommodate. Leaving felt like accepting defeat in a battle I hadn't started but had been forced to fight. As I sat there contemplating, my boss emerged from the side entrance, spotted my truck, and walked over. I rolled down my window. "Everything okay?" she asked. "You've been sitting out here for a while." I nodded toward the envelope on my passenger seat. "Job offer. I'm trying to decide whether to take it." She was quiet for a moment, studying my face. "Because of what happened, partly," I admitted. "Things haven't exactly been comfortable around here." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I won't try to talk you out of doing what's best for your career and well-being. But, before you decide, there's something you should know." She told me that as a result of my complaint, the company had implemented a new training module on accommodating veterans in the workplace. That HR was developing clearer policies around disability harassment. That 2 of the main instigators of the parking game had received formal reprimands that would affect their advancement opportunities. "Your speaking up changed things here," she said. "Not just for you, but potentially for every veteran who works for this company in the future." I hadn't known any of this. I'd been so focused on the personal fallout that I'd missed the systemic changes happening behind the scenes. "Why didn't you tell me this was happening?" I asked. "Our confidentiality," she explained. "I couldn't discuss the specific actions taken against individuals. But the policy changes are going to be announced company-wide next week." I sat with this information, turning it over in my mind. I'd been measuring the aftermath solely in terms of my own comfort, my own social standing. I hadn't considered the broader implications, the potential for institutional change. "Whatever you decide," my boss continued, "I want you to know that you did the right thing. Speaking up was brave, not just for yourself, but for others who might not have had the courage to do so." After she left, I remained in my truck, watching employees arrive for work. I saw the red Jeep pull in, its owner now parking consistently on the opposite side of the lot from my spot. I saw the IT guy who had dismissed my PTSD explanation, his expression carefully neutral as he noticed my truck. I saw the new hire from marketing who had joined after all the drama, who treated me with the same casual friendliness she showed everyone else. The parking spot that had become such a focal point of conflict now seemed simultaneously more and less significant than before. More, because it represented a principle worth defending, the right to reasonable accommodation, to dignity in the workplace, to freedom from targeted harassment. Less, because I now understood that the real battle hadn't been about asphalt and automobiles at all. It had been about visibility. About whether my experience as a combat veteran with PTSD would be acknowledged or erased. About whether my needs would be respected or dismissed as inconvenient. About whether I would be seen as a whole person or reduced to a problem to be managed. In the end, I declined the job offer. Not out of stubbornness or spite, but because leaving would have reinforced the narrative that accommodation is too disruptive, that standing up against discrimination makes you a troublemaker, that veterans with PTSD are better off keeping their needs to themselves. By staying, I was reclaiming not just my parking spot, but my right to exist in civilian spaces without hiding or minimizing my experiences. I was asserting that reasonable accommodation isn't special treatment but basic equity. I was establishing that my value as an employee wasn't diminished by my needs as a veteran. Some days are still harder than others. There are still colleagues who maintain their distance. Still moments when I feel the weight of being different in a workplace that values conformity. But there are also new allies who've approached me privately to express support. New hires who know nothing of the past drama and judge me solely on my work. New opportunities to contribute meaningfully to projects where my military experience provides unique insight. And every morning when I pull into my parking spot, the one outside my window, the one that gives me a sight line and an exit strategy, the one that helps quiet the hypervigilance that Afghanistan instilled in me, I'm reminded that some battles are worth fighting, even when they seem trivial to others. That standing up for yourself isn't selfishness, but self-preservation. That reasonable accommodation isn't weakness, but wisdom. That sometimes, the space between safety and surrender is exactly the size of a parking spot.